teller. And these are deeper than stories. We understand that. But Jesus was the master teacher. He was the teacher come from God. Remember what Nicodemus said in John 3 and verse 2? And so these stories, they are so majestic, they're unforgettable, their beauty sticks with us as we hear them. And so we're taking the time to look at these parables, and tonight we're looking at the parable of the sower. Now, this is found in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I mean, not John, but Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We'll mention that again in just a moment. But in Matthew 13, verses 1 through 9, Jesus tells the parable. And then in verses 18 through 23, he will explain the parable. And the same thing happens in Mark's account. Mark, the 4th chapter, verses 1 through 9, he tells the story. Verses 13 through 20, he will explain the story. Mark's account is the longest. Matthew's is next. Luke has the shortest account. And Luke, the 8th chapter, verses 4 through 8, again, the story is told. And then in verses 11 through 15, Jesus brings the explanation for this story. Tonight we'll be looking at Matthew's account. And so if you have your Bibles, you might want to turn there. We will have the verses on the slides on the wall. But again, the parable of the sower. Let's begin with some points of interest. Now, notice these. The parable of the sower is found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We just mentioned that. It's one of the few parables that Jesus explained. And again, we mentioned that, but think about it. Most of our Lord's parables, he does not explain. But this is one of the few. We mentioned last week in Matthew 13, we have those 7 parables. It's only 2 of those parables that Jesus explains. This one, the parable of the sower, and then the parable of the wheat and tares. And so this is one of the few parables that Jesus explained. In Luke 8 and verse 8, his disciples ask him, what does this parable mean? Now remember, this is when Jesus is teaching in Luke 8, beginning in verse 4. And as he gives them this parable about the sower, they want to know, what does it mean? It's interesting, in Mark 4 and verse 13, Jesus responded and asked, do you not understand this parable? And of course, they didn't. So he would explain for them. It's been called the parable of parables. Now, when we say that, the of here is not a superlative. Sometimes in the Bible, you'll see the of being used as a superlative. You know, the Song of Solomon. Some have referred to it as the Song of Songs. Of all the songs, it's the song. Well, it's not being used like that. You remember in Revelation 19 and verse 16, Jesus is called the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Well, this is not the parable of parables for that reason. Here's the reason. This is not because it was the best or the most outstanding parable, rather because some say it has 4 parables in one. And of course, those who would divide the soil. That's why they suggest that we really have 4 parables in one. Some are intent on calling it by another name. One man referred to it as the parable of the soils because 4 different kinds of soil are mentioned by Jesus. Another man said this should be described as the parable of the 4 soils because that is the variable feature upon which the story turns. And this is interesting to me because, you know, in a lot of the parables, we're tempted at times to say, well, maybe it shouldn't be called that. You know, we've suggested that in times past with the parable of the prodigal son. Why call it the parable of the prodigal son? He's really not the hero. Somebody suggested that it should be called the parable of the loving father. But of course, that parable doesn't have a title. What I find interesting about this parable that some are trying to rename, look at this. The discussion is ended when we hear Jesus proclaim in Matthew 13:18, therefore hear the parable of the sower. So one of the few that he explains, and really one of the few that he himself names. He's the one that called it the parable of the sower. And so Jesus certainly wants us to hear this parable because he uses a double exclamation in Mark 4:3 when he declares, "Listen, behold, a sower went out to sow." This doesn't happen much in Scripture. Jesus begins by saying, "Listen." He's getting their attention. And then, "Behold," this is something to fix their attention upon. And so he uses this double exclamation. Obviously, he wanted his original hearers to hear it. Obviously, he wants us to hear it and to understand it. So, Matthew 13, verses 1 through 9, we'll read that, and then we'll come back and look at verses 18 through 23. We'll read through this first, and then just go back and start looking at this parable. Now, let's do this. I don't know if we'll have time tonight, but we'll be also looking, if not tonight, then of course next Wednesday night, looking at lessons learned. So let's start thinking about that even this evening. What are some lessons that we learn from this parable? And what we'll do is, after we read the parable, we'll open it up for some discussion. We'll open it up for some comments. Again, with the question, what really stands out when you hear the parable of the sower? What is maybe the first thing that you think of? What is the most important thing? What is of great interest to you? Be thinking about those questions. Now, let's read this. Here's verse 1, Matthew 13, beginning in verse 1. On the same day, Jesus went out of the house and sat by the sea. And great multitudes were gathered together to him, so that he got into a boat and sat, and the whole multitude stood on the shore. Now, I think that's interesting, just to stop for a moment and picture that in our minds. Here's Jesus, evidently that great multitude, so big, so large, thronging him, that he gets in a boat and goes out a little bit, and he sits in the boat, and he's teaching those on the shore. So think about that. I read somewhere that the acoustics, because of the water and such, were just perfect for that. Better than what you'll find in many places, probably just like here, where we have to have a microphone and we have to project the voice. But in that setting, the water helped carry the sound. And so these great multitudes gathered together to him, so that he got into a boat and sat, and the whole multitude stood on the shore. Verse 3, then he spoke many things to them in parables, saying, Behold, a sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seed fell by the wayside, and the birds came and devoured them. Some fell on stony places where they did not have much earth, and they immediately sprang up because they had no depth of earth. But when the sun was up, they were scorched. And because they had no root, they withered away. And some fell among thorns, and the thorns sprang up and choked them. But others fell on good ground and yielded a crop, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. So this is what Jesus taught initially. Of course, here is his explanation when the disciples wanted to know, what does the parable mean? Beginning in Matthew 13 and verse 18, therefore, hear the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, then the wicked one comes and snatches away what was sown in his heart. This is he who receives seed by the wayside. But he who received the seed on the stony places, this is he who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy, yet he has no root in himself, but endures only for a while. For when tribulation or persecution arises because of the word, immediately he stumbles. Now he who received the seed among the thorns is he who hears the word, and the cares of this world and the deceitfulness of riches choke the word, and he becomes unfruitful. But he who receives seed on the good ground is he who hears the word and understands it, who indeed bears fruit and produces some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. So again, lessons learned, well, we'll get to that, next Wednesday night. But let's go back to the very beginning. Having heard it again, what stands out in your mind? What is the most important, possibly the most interesting, maybe something that we overlook at times from this parable? Anyone have anything to share, any comments to make? Okay, Sister Patty.
This is showing that every time we teach the truth. It's not going to be accepted by everybody, but that's not our fault. And it is the duty of the person receiving the word to put it to good use. But we have to continue and not worry. Well, we do worry, but not be discouraged by those that we try to teach and they don't accept the word. Okay. Because all sorts of things can come in, as he shows in this parable, that people allow to keep them from receiving the word. But that's not the fault of the teacher, as long as that teacher is teaching the truth.
Okay. Excellent point. Again, our responsibility is to sow the seed. We are to spread the word. We are to teach the word. And as Patty points out, we're not responsible for the reception of it. At times we want to be, we wish we could be, because we understand that the gospel has the power to save a soul. The gospel has the same power to comfort and to help people through difficulties, and we know that, but some don't, and so their lives are in shambles, and yet they still won't turn to God, and it breaks our heart. A lot of this is like Luke 10, the parable of the Good Samaritan. We see this man beaten, and then here comes the priest, and here comes the Levite, and of course, the parable takes a little turn. We thought they were going to help, but they didn't. And so then all of a sudden that pessimistic parable becomes optimistic, because here comes the Good Samaritan. And it's sort of like this. We see that precious seed. It falls on the wayside soil. It falls upon the stony places. It falls upon the thorns. And again, it's sort of pessimistic in a sense, because none of them bring any fruit. None of them bring any maturity because of that seed. But then that pessimism turns to optimism, because here is the good ground. The good ground, and it receives it. And of course it brings forth 100-fold, 60-fold, 30-fold. One time, quite a few years ago, one of my friends, you know him, I called him by name, so I'm not going to, but he went out one night and he was teaching someone. And when he got back, he found me. I forgot what the situation was, but he was so down. He was so discouraged. He even was brought to tears because he said, "I failed." And so we started talking, and I said, "Well, what are you talking about?" And he said, "Well, I had a Bible study tonight, and the person didn't do anything. They didn't obey it." And I told him, I said, "You didn't fail. What you did was what you had to do and should have done. You didn't fail, you succeeded. The failure doesn't lie with you, it lies upon the person who heard the word and didn't do anything with it." And we need to understand that. Not much is said about this sower, is there? A sower went out to sow. Now, some want to say this is Jesus. I don't have a problem with that, because in the parable of the wheat and tares, he is the one that sows good seed in the soil in his vineyard. And remember, Matthew 13 and verse 37 identifies the one who sowed the seed is the Son of Man. And then, of course, the one who sowed the tares was the devil. But I don't think, even though it's not wrong, certainly to say this is Jesus, I think his application is much broader here. It's anybody, it's everybody. He's teaching the disciples that this is what they're going to be doing. And the sower in that day, it was a broadcast sow. You know, it wasn't this specific, let me get this, little patch over here and just put some there. It's a broadcast. That's why it's falling all over the place. It's going on that wayside soil. It's going on the stony ground. It's going on where the thorns are, but it's also going on the good soil. But that's our work. 1 Corinthians 3 and verse 6. What did Paul say? I planted. We could also say I sowed. I planted, Apollos watered, God gave the increase. Well, what we're looking at here in this parable is how it does increase. And I'm not saying that God doesn't give the increase. Obviously He does. But that is dependent upon us too. We should be fellow workers with God. 2 Corinthians 6 and verse 1. Some hear the word of God and they don't do anything with it. And so that's what we're seeing here. We're seeing the results of that precious seed, the word being sown, and really that soil is representing hearts, isn't it? Another comment?
Yeah. No, Ken, I was just finna say that the sower, he need to make sure that he is able to sow the seed rightly, because sometimes if you ain't careful, you can do more damage than by not knowing what you're doing.
Okay. Very, very good point. Now, let's not let that discourage us from sowing. If you have to just read people's scripture, do it. Do it. Instead of saying, well, I can't do that because I might mess up, I might say something that's not right. Well, I know you're not going to say anything wrong if you just put down scripture and just tell somebody, let's look at these scripture. And you wouldn't even have to add comment to it. But that's right. That's right. And so the sower, again, not much attention is given concerning him. And so let's make sure that Jesus, yes, we recognize him as the sower in Matthew 13, the apostles, but it comes down to each and every one of us sowing that seed. And again, the success is not dependent upon us. We just sow the seed. Any other comments when you hear this parable? What comes to mind? Any observations? Any comments? Any lessons? Okay, Sister Helen.
Ken, this reminds me of a plant that I had, and I tried everything I could to try to save that plant because it was special. And so I would water it and go back and check on it, and it still just looked kind of, weak and everything. Put a little plant food on it, and it looked like it perked up a little bit, and then all of a sudden, it was back down again. So finally, I think it just finally decided to just give on up, and that's the way some people are. You can just, you teach them and you tell them, you don't give up on them right then. You just keep on and water them a little bit more. Some of them, like you say, they might fall by the wayside, and some of the others, if you keep talking to them, they'll finally open those ears and hear. And there's others, no matter what you say, they have a closed ear to the word. So you just have to go on and plant some more seed.
Okay. Very, very good observation. You remember the fig tree that Jesus cursed because he did everything he could for that tree to bear fruit, and it just wouldn't bear fruit. In our own lives, maybe it's loved ones, maybe it's children, maybe it's, other relatives, maybe it's dear friends, but you did everything you could to cultivate the soil, everything you could to help that soil. And sometimes, again, it's not up to us, is it? It's up to the soil, how it's received, how this precious word is received. And so, any other comments? If there's no other comments, we're just going to go back and look at some of this and make note. Now, what I've tried to do, where Luke or Mark would add something, I've tried to put down in my notes that little difference. You know, I'm so thankful. Sometimes people say, well, why do we have 4 accounts of the life of Christ? Well, you know, usually when someone asks that, they haven't taken the time to read them and study them, because after you read and study them, you're not asking anymore, why do we have 4 accounts? You're saying, I am so thankful. I am so grateful that we have 4 accounts, because Matthew says something that Mark doesn't. Mark adds something that Luke doesn't tell us. Luke reveals something maybe that none of them have said. John, they're all different. They're all written for a different purpose, and really, to a certain extent, to capture the ear of a different audience. And so we ought to be so thankful. But let's look at this now. Notice it says, on the same day, Jesus went out of the house and sat by the sea. Well, the same day, go back and look at chapter 12. You'll see several things that happen. And I think this is important too, because you know, we're talking about the different responses to the word. Jesus has seen all of this. Jesus has seen all of this already in his ministry. He has seen those who live like that wayside soil. Their hearts are hard. There's nothing you can do. He has seen that stony ground, the stony places. And, you know, it springs up quickly. It's received with, quote, joy, but then it falls away just as quickly. You remember in John 6 and verse 66, many withdrew and were following him no more. Jesus has seen all of these responses. The thorns. You know, what happens is we don't get our lives cleaned up. We keep them all cluttered with everything in this world, and so pretty soon all that clutter just overwhelms. It just overwhelms us. And that's what he's trying to point out. Those thorns, the roots of those thorns, they're vying for that same ground that this seed that's been planted, this seed wants that ground. The thorns have their roots in that ground. Who's going to win? Well, in our lives, if we don't clean up our lives, and if we don't do what the Bible tells us, Ephesians 4 and verse 22, remember, we are to lay aside or to put off some things. And then in verse 24 of Ephesians 4, we are to put on other things. Well, if we don't put stuff aside and take things off and put things on, then our lives are going to be like that. It's going to be all cluttered. And finally, those thorns will rise up and choke the word. And so Jesus has seen all of this. He's also seen the good ground. His disciples who want to know others, who genuinely follow him because they say, we know who you are. And so on the same day, Jesus went out of the house and sat by the sea. Verse number 2. And great multitudes were gathered together to him, so that he got in a boat and sat, and the whole multitude stood on the shore. You know, when you look at verse 2, it's interesting. Here's what Mark adds to this. In Mark 4 and verse 1, it says, the multitude was on the land facing the sea. Well, that's implied in what Matthew is saying. But Mark just spells it out. Jesus gets in a boat, he rows out a ways, and he's sitting down looking at them. They are there facing the sea. They're ready to listen. They're ready to hear. And Luke also says this in Luke 8 and verse 4, they had come to him from every city. Now remember, in Matthew 11, in Matthew 12, he's been healing. So his name, his reputation has traveled. People are coming from all over. They come from every city. This is a multitude. Jesus knows I've got to go out if I'm going to teach this whole multitude. And so that's what he does. He's in the boat. He's sitting down. The multitude is facing him, facing the sea. Jesus begins to teach them this wonderful parable. Then he spoke many things to them in parables, saying, Behold, a sower went out to sow. Now again, I find it very interesting here that Jesus does not expound about this sower. He doesn't give us names. He doesn't get into details, doesn't tell us what he's wearing, doesn't tell us anything. This is a sower went out to sow. You know, you wonder, this is a huge crowd, and you wonder if there are some farmers in this audience. You wonder if Jesus, when he's out there, could he see in the countryside those actually sowing seed while he is teaching? You know, October was the month when they would begin doing the sowing. And they would go out and they would do, as we've said, broadcast this seed, probably seed of wheat or barley, but they would just put it everywhere. They were just throwing it. And so that's why it lands in all of these different areas. And so he's speaking many things to them in parables, but again, behold, a sower. That's all he says, a sower went out to sow. You know, let me emphasize this too. If we have the proper attitude and the right humility, this is all that needs to be said. We don't need fanfare. We don't need glowing reports. We're just sowers. We're just doing what we should be doing. A sower went out to sow. And so notice verse 4, and as he sowed, some seed fell by the wayside, and the birds came and devoured them. Now this wayside, it's probably the path surrounding areas, maybe vineyards in places like this that people walked. And so this is hard. This has been packed down. This is like pavement. This is like concrete. This is like asphalt. This is hard ground because these are walking paths. And so some seed, notice some seed, fell by the wayside. And the birds came and devoured them. Now think about this. Later on we're going to be told that it is Satan who comes immediately. So right now as Jesus tells this story, the birds are going to be represented by Satan. And they probably saw this concerning physical birds. They're out sowing the seed, and you look back, and here are these birds picking up the seed as it's being sown. Well, that's the activity of Satan. Again, in the real sense, as Jesus will explain the parable. So the birds came and devoured them. Again, some fell on stony places where they did not have much earth, and they immediately sprang up because they had no depth of earth. You know, when you look at verse 5, Luke will say, in Luke 8 and verse 6, instead of the stony places, he just calls it a rock. And this is probably places in the soil that the actual rock is protruding. Here it is, and they're not clearing all of this out, and so they're just sowing the seed. But this stony places, not much earth. There's not much soil there. And so as Jesus tells the story, immediately this springs up because it had no depth of earth. Again, Luke will also say in Luke 8 and verse 6, it lacked moisture. And so this is looking for moisture. It can't take root in this soil because there's not much depth here. And that's why it takes roots, so that the roots can extend down and get that moisture. You know, a lot of times you'll see ground and on the top it's a little bit parched, but the roots are feeding from underneath. And so this has no underneath. There's not much earth here. It springs up quick. but there's no depth of earth. You know, we could say this, and I don't think this would be wrong, but the wayside soil, that which is trampled down, that which is hard, that's a hard heart. That's what it's representing. You can't penetrate that heart for whatever reason. And you try, but they've made their hearts like an adamant stone. That's what the Old Testament prophet said, Zechariah 7 in verse 11. And so a hard-hearted hearer. Here we could say an emotional hearer. We're going to see in Jesus' explanation that this ground receives it with joy. An emotional hearer. They hear this and they're probably like Acts 17, like the Epicureans, the Stoic philosophers. They gather every day to tell or to hear something new. They just want to hear something new, and this is intriguing, and I like this, and yes, I think I want to do this, and so immediately they spring up. But as we'll see, sad because there's no depth here, as immediately as they spring up, almost as immediately they fall away. They're emotional hearers. You know, when Paul writes to his brethren in Galatia, what does he tell them? I am amazed that you are so quickly deserting him. Again, Paul went to Galatia, taught them, they received the word, and now as quickly they've turned away from it. They've departed from it. Paul says, for another gospel, which there really isn't another gospel. Some have distorted the gospel of Christ. Well, you find these kind of hearers all over the place. Some don't want to hear at all. They really don't want to listen. They're the wayside soil, hard hearts. Some want to hear because they think this just might be the solution to my problem. I've tried everything else. You know, it's like the dieters who, they've tried every diet, and so here's a new diet, it's really working, and so, man, they're jumping on it because this is the one that's going to work for me. It doesn't either. As soon as they start it, they're off of it. Speak from experience, okay? So, again, but this is the hearer of the Word of God. Now, look what else we see here. But when the sun was up, they were scorched, and because they had no root, they withered away. Have you ever seen someone like that? They start attending maybe. They have a great interest. Someone studies with them, they obey the gospel, and almost as immediately as they came and obeyed the Christ, almost immediately, where are they? Where's sister so-and-so? Where's brother so-and-so? Well, here it is. There's no depth there. And so the sun has come up. You'll see this, just like the birds, Jesus will talk about Satan coming, snatching it away. This sun that comes up, that scorches, this is persecution. This is as what Michael talked about tonight, time of temptation. Now they're being persecuted because of the word that they received with joy, and now since they're being persecuted, they're out of here. They're not going to continue to follow that word. And so, no root. They withered away. How sad. The language here. I think we'll probably bring this up next week in lessons. But, you know, when you look at what's happening here, some are snatched, some are scorched, and some are choked. None of those are good. I don't think any of us want to have those things happen to us spiritually. Snatched, scorched, choked. But that's what happened. And because of that, they wither. They wither. There goes their spiritual life. It says, and some fell among thorns, and the thorns sprang up and choked them. You know, Mark's going to add in Mark 4 and verse 7 that these right here, they yielded no crop. That's what happened. They received it, but again, they are among thorns. This ground is vying for, you know, the soil. And so this seed is up against all these other thorns. And again, as we've said, This is why the Bible teaches us to live with single-hearted devotion, not be cluttered as we go through this life. Remember 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 35, undistracted devotion. This is probably a perfect example of Martha. Martha, you are so distracted, you're so bothered with many things, and only one thing is necessary. Well, here it is. Again, 2 Timothy 2 and verse 4, no soldier in active service entangles himself in the everyday affairs of this life in order that he might please him who enlisted him as a soldier. Well, we get our lives so cluttered with anything and everything, and pretty soon we don't have time for this and we don't have time for that, and in the spiritual, so many times is what takes the hit, isn't it? Can't come to Wednesday night, I can't come Sunday morning, I can't come, and pretty soon there's no excuses, I'm just not coming. I'm not coming. Well, fell among the thorns, thorns sprang up and choked them. But others fell on good ground. And again, here's what makes this whole parable worth it. Others fell on good ground. Here's the Samaritan that just turns that whole story. You're sitting there and you're thinking, really? As a priest, you went by on the other side? And really? You Levite, you went by on the other side? And about the time you're a little bit down hearing the story, now you're brought back up, because here's the Good Samaritan. A little bit down because we hear about this precious seed being sown, and the first 3 attempts, just nothing. But here's the good ground. Good ground, and notice, just like we said, Mark added, and yielded no crop. Well, notice, but others fell on good ground and yielded a crop. Some 100-fold. What a bumper crop that represents. 100-fold. Some 60, some 30. And so as Jesus teaches this without any explanation now, he says, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. Well, notice now. Let's go to the explanation and just notice some of the things that Jesus is talking about here. Again, trying to use what Luke says, trying to add what Mark says when it's applicable. Look at verse 18. Therefore, hear the parable of the sower. Let's remember, we use this verse because Jesus identifies the title of this parable. It's the parable of the sower. Verse 19, when anyone, notice that, this is anyone. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, then the wicked one comes and snatches away what was sown in his heart. This is he who receives seed by the wayside. Now, notice this. When anyone hears what? The word of the kingdom. In Mark's account, he's just going to say the word. In Luke's account, he's going to say the seed is the word of God. So this word of the kingdom, the word of God, is all the same. This is what's being sown. But if anyone hears the word of the kingdom, does not understand it, notice what happens. Then the wicked one comes. Matthew refers to Satan as the wicked one. Luke will refer to him as the devil. And Mark will refer to him as Satan. Mark 4 and verse 15, Satan comes immediately to snatch it away. He understands the power of this seed that we're talking about. He knows what's going to happen if it's left there. If it can do its work, then he knows what's going to happen. So this is the one who received by the wayside. But he who receives seed on stony places, this is he who hears the word, notice, and immediately receives it with joy. Oh, this is the best thing I've ever heard. You know, Mark's going to say they receive it with gladness. Same principle here. But once again, yet he has no root in himself, but endures only for a while. For when tribulation or persecution arises, notice, because of the word, immediately he stumbles. One translation will say he becomes unfruitful. But again, think about this. This is the son. When Jesus told the picture, the story, the parable, this is that son. The son is representing this tribulation and persecution. So he receives the word immediately. But when Satan comes immediately, or when forces come in his life immediately to persecute, to tempt, well, immediately he stumbles. He becomes unfaithful. Now he who receives seed among the thorns is he who hears the word, and the cares of this world and the deceitfulness of riches choke out the word, and he becomes unfruitful. Here's these thorns. Remember what we said? That ground. There's only so much ground, and the thorns are vying for it. This precious seed is vying for it. Well, if we don't uproot, remember what Jeremiah was told? You pluck up, tear down, destroy, and overthrow, and then you build and plant. You get rid of that stuff first, and then you build and plant. Well, what's crowding this out, what's choking this one? The cares of this world and the deceitfulness of riches. You know, both Luke and Mark will talk about the cares and the riches. Mark will add the pleasures of this world and the cares of this world. And so again, what we're looking at here is that which is crowding out that word. I wonder in our own lives, you know, is there anything that's crowding out the word or our spiritual effectiveness, our spiritual efforts? And so again, becomes unfruitful. But he who receives seed on the good soil is he who hears the word and understands it, who indeed bears fruit and produces, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. What's interesting is Mark will reverse these totals. He'll begin with 30, and then 60, and then 100. But nevertheless, this is the one who received the seed on the good ground. Notice what he does. He, like the rest, he hears it. He hears the word. Now, Matthew's going to say, and understands it. You know, this is interesting. In Mark 4 in verse 20, Mark's going to say, instead of understands it, accepts it. So here's the one who hears it, and they understand it, they accept it. Luke's going to tell us that they keep it. And Luke will also add that this one right here has an honest and good heart. Now, think about that. The soil is representing the conditions of people's heart. This last one, they have an honest and good heart. Thus, they hear and they understand and they accept it and they keep it and they bear fruit. That's what it takes in all of our lives. Now, having heard the parable, please, let's do this. Write down one or a couple of lessons learned from this. And what we'll do next Wednesday night, we'll just turn our attention to the lessons that we can extract from this great parable, the parable of the sower. Thank you for your comments tonight. Good to see everyone. If you will, read over this parable a few times this next week and be looking for lessons. Please submit them to me. Write them down on a piece of paper. Give them to me. We'll share them with everyone in class. Good to see everyone. Glad you're here.